Ever wonder if there's a secret history? A time when people with psychic abilities were rounded up and called mad? It's a powerful question that gets right to the heart of how we think about sanity, power, and the unseen. The truth is, there wasn't some grand conspiracy to lock up psychics in the 1800s. The reality is far more subtle, and honestly, a lot more disturbing. Let's start with a key fact. The diagnosis of a schizophrenia didn't even exist in the 1800s. That term was coined in 1908 by a Swiss psychiatrist named Eugen Bleuler. Before that, if you had unusual perceptions or behaviors, like hearing voices or seeing visions, you'd be labeled with much vaguer terms. Words like madness, mania, melancholia, or, especially for women, hysteria. These experiences weren't seen through a medical lens. They were viewed through a moral, religious, or even criminal one. You weren't sick, you were sinful, possessed, or just a troublemaker. But does that mean people weren't institutionalized for these experiences? Absolutely not. People who claim to have prophetic visions, speak with spirits, or possess psychic gifts were definitely confined in asylums. This was especially true if they were poor, female, or from a marginalized community. If you challenged the church, disrupted social norms, and didn't have a powerful family to protect you, you were at risk. Think about the spiritualist movement that swept through the mid to late 1800s. While many mediums operated openly, those from lower classes could easily find their trances and channelings labeled as signs of mental instability. Female mystics claiming to talk to angels were often dismissed as delusional or hysterical. And in colonized places like North America, indigenous healers and shamans were systematically labeled as dangerous or insane, a convenient way to suppress their culture and power. So it was never really about psychic ability itself. It was about straying from the norm, especially when your gender, class, or race already made you an outsider. This all came to a head in the late 19th and early 20th centuries with the rise of modern psychiatry. This new field wanted to be a respectable science. It aimed to classify and control human behavior. And in a world obsessed with material, measurable facts, anything that couldn't be explained by science was immediately suspect. Suddenly, hearing voices wasn't a spiritual gift. It was a hallucination, a sign of madness. Claiming to contact the spirit world wasn't mysticism. It was a delusion, a symptom of psychosis. Prophetic dreams weren't divine messages. They were signs of grandiosity and mania. This new medical framework completely stripped away the cultural and spiritual context. A village seer who was revered in her community would be seen as a broken machine in a Victorian asylum, to be fixed with ice-cold baths, physical restraints, or solitary confinement. As the historian Roy Porter famously wrote, madness has always been less about biology and more about who holds the power to define reality. So, was this all driven by fear? Yes, but it wasn't just a fear of psychics. Society was terrified of losing rational control during an age that worshipped scientific progress. The idea of direct spiritual experience, bypassing the authority of the church, was deeply threatening. So was the idea of women claiming divine authority. Psychic phenomena challenged the very foundation of the Enlightenment. The belief that reality is objective, measurable, and follows predictable laws. To admit that some people could see beyond this was to admit that the entire project of modernity might be built on a faulty premise. Even today this tension exists. The official diagnostic manual for mental disorders acknowledges that believing in psychic phenomena or spiritual possession isn't automatically a sign of illness, unless it goes against a person's cultural norms. So, a Pentecostal Christian speaking in tongues is seen as culturally acceptable. But an atheist in a secular country who claims to have spirit guides might get a diagnosis. The line between a spiritual experience and a mental illness is still drawn by culture, not by some absolute scientific truth. So, while there was no organized plot, there was a clear pattern of erasure. A systemic tendency to pathologize, silence, and institutionalize anyone whose inner world did not fit the dominant model of reality, especially if they lacked social power. Countless genuine seers, intuitives, and spiritually gifted people were likely misdiagnosed and medicated into silence. Not because they were sick, but because their way of knowing was a threat to a worldview that only trusted what it could see, measure, and control. The psychiatrist Stanislav Grof put it perfectly. We have confused the map with the territory. We have mistaken the model of reality for reality itself, and called everyone who sees beyond it mad. The history isn't one of a grand conspiracy, but of a quiet, systemic violence against ways of knowing that didn't fit the story. And in many ways, that's even more insidious. Now let's dig into a fascinating part of this story: the connection between the rise of psychiatry and the Catholic Church. Was Eugen Bleuler, the man who coined schizophrenia, secretly working for the Church? The short answer is no. There's no direct link. But there's a deep, powerful historical connection that set the stage for everything that followed. First, let's be clear about Eugen Bleuler. He was a secular scientist. He was the director of a prominent asylum in Zurich, Switzerland, and his work was based on empirical observation and the emerging field of psychoanalysis, not theology. When he proposed the term schizophrenia in 1908, he was trying to create a more scientific description for what he was observing in his patients. So, Bleuler himself was not some agent of the Church. But, and this is a big but, the institutions he worked in were deeply entangled with the Church. Where did asylums come from? The very first institutions for the insane in Europe were often founded and run by religious orders. The earliest known asylum in Valencia, Spain, was established under Catholic authority way back in 1409. For centuries, Catholic congregations ran a huge number of psychiatric facilities. Even as state-run asylums became more common in the 1800s, the staff often included nuns and priests, and the treatment was infused with moral and religious frameworks. The asylum didn't just spring out of science. It evolved from monasteries, madhouses, and houses of correction, many of which were under Church control. The real connection, the hook, isn't organizational. It's conceptual. It's about the shift from sin to symptom. For more than 1,000 years, the Church was the ultimate authority on inner experiences. If you had visions or heard voices, it was either divine grace, if it aligned with Church doctrine, or it was demonic possession and heresy if it didn't. There was no middle ground. When psychiatry emerged, it didn't invent a new system from scratch. It secularized this existing binary. Approved rational thought was now called sanity. Unapproved, unorthodox inner experiences were now called delusions. As the French philosopher Michel Foucault argued, the asylum basically replaced the confessional booth. It was a new space for judging and correcting behavior that deviated from the norm. So, when Bleuler put a new medical label on fragmented perception, he wasn't operating in a vacuum. He was working within a cultural framework that had been shaped for centuries by Christian ideas about order, chaos, sin, and the danger of an unruly inner world. He didn't need to quote the Bible. The assumptions were already baked into the system. Let's get the timeline straight. Psychiatric institutions existed long before Bleuler's schizophrenia, in 1908. The first modern asylums appeared in the late 1700s. The word psychiatry itself was coined in the year 1800. By the time Bleuler came along, the institutional machinery was already well established across Europe, built on a foundation of Church-influenced social control. Bleuler's diagnosis simply gave a new, scientific-sounding name to the people who were already being confined within those walls. The historical force here is a continuum. It's an unbroken thread that runs from the Church defining spiritual deviance as dangerous, to secular society redefining that deviance as mental illness, and finally to psychiatry providing the language and institutions to manage it. Boulez didn't create this system, but his work became a powerful tool within it. The connection isn't a single person or a specific date. It's the long, shadowy transition from heresy to hallucination, from exorcism to electroshock, woven through Western culture by powers that have always feared what they could not control. And that right there is the hidden history of how the mystic became the madman. Thanks for watching.